Señoras y señores, muy buenos días. En nombre de la Facultad de Arquitectura, Arte y Diseño de la Universidad de Portales, damos la más cordial bienvenida a la tercera y última jornada de Rizomas, Seminario Internacional Transdisciplina, Innovación y Aprendizaje, actividad organizada por la Facultad de Arquitectura, Arte y Diseño, Factoría UDD y el Laboratorio de Materiales y Prototipos LASO, con la colaboración de la Dirección de Desarrollo Docente y la Dirección de Investigación e Innovación de la Universidad Diego Portales. Saludamos muy especialmente al decano de la Facultad de Arquitectura y Diseño, María Flores, a la directora de Arquitectura, Carolina del Campo, a nuestros expositores, autoridades académicas y académicos que nos acompañan, tanto como amigos y amigas, y a quienes nos están presenciando en este seminario Viastri. Sean todos y todas muy bienvenidos. Rizoma, Seminario Internacional Transdisciplina, Innovación y Aprendizaje, un espacio de reflexión colectiva que transfiera, debata y medite sobre experiencias teóricas y prácticas relacionadas con el ejercicio transdisciplinar, la innovación y el aprendizaje. Con ello, identificar las transformaciones que se requieren efectuar en los modelos de aprendizaje en función a los desafíos de nuestra era, que son complejos, dinámicos y emergentes. Rizomas busca incorporar la transdisciplina, innovación e investigación aplicada en la comunidad académica en su conjunto, desencapsular el debate disciplinar, detonando interacciones que permitan la formación de un ecosistema complejo a nivel universitario y crear las bases de un proceso que debiese tener a la implementación de un proyecto de innovación pedagógica transversal en la estructura de la universidad. Hoy hablaremos de ecosistemas. Para la inicio de este seminario invito a los organizadores, el académico de la Escuela de Arquitectura y director de Factoría, Andrés Briceño, y Nicolás Cavallo, director del Laboratorio de Materiales y Prototipos LAMO, académico también de la Escuela de Arquitectura.
Buenos días. Bueno, estamos llegando a la última jornada del seminario. Y la razón por la que planteamos hablar sobre ecosistemas era porque nos parecía muy razonable que después de realizar experiencias, casos concretos, cuestiones que de algún modo emergen eventualmente espontáneas, tal como en el deporte a veces salen estrellas un poco solas, ¿no? Pero no es producto a veces de justamente las estructuras o el ecosistema que nos rodea, ¿no? Entonces la idea es justamente poder hablar sobre cómo crear un ecosistema que permita, que facilite, que fortalezca oportunidades bajo la materia que el seminario se propone, ¿no? Cómo podemos crear una organización así, que facilite justamente el proceso disciplinar, que favorezca la creación, la innovación, sin disciplinas encapsuladas. Nos parece muy relevante. Porque más allá de las buenas prácticas, los elementos que hemos ya detectado, que empiezan a cumplir una suerte de patrón, eventualmente de cómo podríamos aproximarnos a estas maneras de generar el proceso de aprendizaje, nos parece muy importante tratar de detectar cómo operan las organizaciones que pueden permitir y facilitar eso. Bajo esa perspectiva, la idea de hablar sobre ecosistemas es justamente poder dar una revisión a los elementos que pueden ser partícipes del momento que la universidad está hoy día viviendo, ¿no? Particularmente por el plan estratégico que se ha señalado. El principal concepto de ese plan estratégico es conectar, conexión. ¿Cómo creamos un ecosistema que lo facilite y que de algún modo permita justamente una suerte de contaminación cruzada positiva, digamos, para crear ese nuevo mundo? Me parece muy relevante. Entonces, muchas gracias por el apoyo y la asistencia, así que esperemos que sea algo. Gracias.
Bueno, finalmente llegamos a nuestra última sesión, así que primero darle la bienvenida. Y como segundo, hacer una pequeña reflexión con respecto a qué ecosistema significa y cómo el ecosistema proviene de ese entendimiento de la naturaleza, donde la complejidad de un sistema no está dado por la especificidad ni la jerarquía de cada uno de los elementos que lo conforman, sino por una complejidad que se da a partir de muchos elementos que no son aparentemente complejos, pero que generan un sistema de una complejidad mucho mayor. ¿Por qué digo esto? Porque de alguna manera el ecosistema que nosotros estamos tratando de reflexionar sobre cómo se forma algo que le dé soporte y sustancia a todos los temas que hemos discutido a lo largo de este seminario, tiene que ver con esas complejidades individuales que no necesariamente tienen una alta jerarquía, sino que en su conjunto conforman una complejidad mayor. ¿Cómo se forma ese ecosistema? Es algo que vamos a tratar de descubrir a lo largo de las conversaciones que vamos a tener hoy en día. Y cómo, de alguna manera, se piensa sobre esas necesidades que el ecosistema tiene, es algo de las cosas que también queremos descubrir. Nos parece muy relevante que esta reflexión exista dentro del entorno donde trabajamos, dentro de nuestro entorno universitario, no solo a partir de lo que se hace en la academia, sino de lo que se hace en distintas situaciones, en distintas partes, en distintas, de alguna manera, lugares donde el ecosistema pasa a ser una pieza fundamental. Es por eso que los distintos invitados que vamos a tener, todos a partir de bagajes distintos, disciplinas distintas, nos van a mostrar cómo ese ecosistema que soporta esta interacción, que favorece la transdisciplina, que favorece la relación entre las partes para formar sistemas muchísimo más complejos, se lleva a cabo. Así que muy bienvenidos y esperamos que sea una sesión muy fructífera. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, señores directores, y daremos inicio a nuestra presentación principal. Perdón. Daremos inicio a nuestra presentación principal. Antes les quiero ofrecer, tenemos va a ser la conferencia en inglés, traducción simultánea. Quienes deseen interruptores están detrás, los pueden retirar sin problema, para que tengamos una comunicación fluida con nuestros invitados. Y la presentación principal está a cargo de David Cavallo, de Decana, que luego tendrá una conversación vía streaming con la Decana de la Facultad de Educación que nos acompaña, Paula Louzano. Para quienes no conocen a David, el profesor Cavallo posee un doctorado en Artes Mediales y Ciencias 2020. En su vasta experiencia ha sido exdirector del Future Learning Hub Media, la UNIT, grupo que dirigía con el destacado científico Simon Craig, vicepresidente de Educación y director de Aprendizaje del proyecto One Laptop per Shield, iniciativa global liderada por Media UNIT y ONU, ex profesor titular de la Universidad Federal do Sul de Bahía y consultor de Farm Foundation del Center for Freedom, Atom Smith, entre otras destacadas experiencias desarrolladas en distintos países del mundo. Actualmente es investigador principal del Centro de Innovación y Desarrollo Avanzado CINDA, en Santiago de Chile, e investigador visitante del Instituto de Estudios Avanzados de la Universidad de Sao Paulo, Brasil. David, muy bienvenido.
A very good morning to everybody. I apologize that I'm not able to be there with you right now, but I hope to be there in the coming months and stay for quite a while. And I also apologize for speaking in English. And I guess to connect to kind of the ideas we want to talk about, I'm going to give some stories around, innovative ecosystems and things that have really changed the world. And I don't want to give anyone the sense that I think these are the only ones or even the best ones or anything like that. But these are the personal ones. These are the ones I know about and at times have been fortunate to participate in. So I want to use them more as examples as opposed to, this is the only history. And so it's a very personal story. And thinking about it in terms of how this works, coming across to you via, the screen with voice and everything, of the unfortunate acronyms that has taken hold in the world. And it's an important part when we think about innovation. Everybody refers to TIC, or ICT in English, information communication technology. And certainly, those are things we do, but those are the things that we're able to do with computation that really just amplified things we were able to do before computation. And, so it isn't that, information's not important, but yes, but we had information before. We had people with access, had libraries or whatever. We had communication tools before. So it's better, and now we see it from the pandemic that, we can do things online that we weren't able to do before, but they aren't really what's fundamentally innovative or powerful that comes from computation. And part of what I'm going to show you is like some of these things that really do that in a way to make us think that, the barriers to innovation and why are they there? And so like the title is no one speaks against innovation, nobody. But yet if nobody's against it, why is it so rare? And these are the parts we have to think about. And as I said, I apologize for speaking in English, but one thing that I've learned from trying to speak about the research in other languages is that even though the information that I want to present is the same, even though I have the words and the language to communicate it, there's still something missing, particularly in the flow of ideas. And I don't know, for those of you that speak, there's a joke I like, which is that if you speak 3 languages or more, you're polylingual. If you speak 2 languages, you're bilingual. And if you speak 1 language, you're American. And so we have this issue, but it's like, well, why, if I have the words in Spanish or Portuguese, if I have the ideas deep in my soul, why is it hard to connect? Why is it hard to convey these ideas? Why is it hard to really have a flow, not just as a speech, but as an interaction, which is where you get a deeper development of thought and ideas. And so it's in these parts that are less obvious, but more important, that we really want to think about. Well, if we want to develop ecosystems that are more conducive for innovation, what are the elements? What would be a minimum set of elements that you need to do this? So this was supposed to be a temporary building to last for 3 years that lasted for 55. And this is the famous, at least among people at MIT, Building 20. So Building 20 was constructed during the war, World War II, to give space, because there wasn't enough space as more activities were ramping up. But inside Building 20 was something quite amazing. So unlike a lot of the university buildings before that, this was not a space where it's only the electrical engineers, or it's only the linguistics department. But the people that went into Building 20, partly by accident and partly by choice of the people, were some of the most amazing people that were there. And so much of what we think about from MIT came out of this building. So people in Building 20, so like Norbert Wiener, one of the founders of cybernetics, among others, obviously, when he went from Harvard, he was at Harvard, he was a PhD in mathematics, and he decided to go to MIT. His family was really upset. It's like, why would you leave Harvard to go to that little technical school? MIT wasn't always with this sterling reputation or the reputation that it has now. MIT, to people at Harvard, was, it's a technical school. You learn how to put wires together. And the family really, objected to it. And the point was that it was there that the ideas of in cybernetics with Wiener and many others could be developed because it broke new ground. It was innovative, and was innovative as giving us a different way of looking at things, but those who were powerful or really the stars of the older ways of thinking, they weren't necessarily happy for these new innovations that really did a lot to improve the world. But it wasn't just Wiesner that was there. So a lot of the early work in artificial intelligence, in radar, in Chomsky was there in linguistics, was in this space. And so it was people from all different backgrounds and all different types of ideas. And all of them were multidisciplinary in themselves. So almost all of them had a deep understanding and background in mathematics, but as a means to apply this kind of formal, rigorous thinking into other areas. But something else was really important there is that it wasn't just, let's just do a technical thing, let's really invent and create. And this was a very hands-on activity. So everybody that worked at Building 20 would tell you, it's like, oh yeah, well, we got this new device and we wanted to think about doing it. Or I had this idea and I wasn't quite sure. So they would knock down the walls to do things. Minsky had a thing where he wanted to look at, and if he lined up, I forget the number, but let's call it 300 ball bearings, each one of which was like, just slightly bigger than the other. So you go from really tiny to really large, and you have 100 of them. And he wanted to see in terms of what would happen with force if you tapped on it at one end, what would happen at the other end. Because you have mathematical models, you have your ideas, you have the basis in physics, but you wanted a physical way to actually try the experiment to see what would happen. And so this hands-on, this constructive part, this way of just like, what's this idea? Let's figure this out. The importance of physical materials was deep inside the culture of the space. And so when you needed to try something like that, that needed a ton of space, you could do it. You could change the space because the idea and the experiments were more important than the physical imprint of the space. Minsky actually finally did that when he was working in a summer at Bell Labs, and he almost killed the person because what happened is it's basically like shooting something out of a gun, and one of the ball bearing at the end went through 2 walls and almost hit somebody. So it could have been a catastrophe. But it's in, not catastrophe, but in this spirit is that this is really where so many things took hold. But the idea of the space as not just, as an active space, you're making things, you're doing things, and you're connecting, in the case of computation, the computational with the physical to help us to really understand these kind of connections and the depth that goes beyond. And so in 1963, Yvonne Sutherland did Sketchpad, which even for the time was spectacular. And I think, yeah, there in the text box, you see the YouTube link. I encourage you to look at it. And keep in mind that this is 60 years ago, yet and so many of you are architects and designers or engineers of some type. So you're used to the tools that we have today. But if you think about what were the computers like 60 years ago, and here's the kind of thing that Sutherland did that even just now we're finally getting to be able to do and to understand. And so it was this kind of thinking of people like Sutherland to think of really important ideas, of things that could be really good, and then try to do it. And so it's just quite amazing what they were able to accomplish. And Alan Kay, who I mentioned him briefly, was a student of Sutherland's when he had moved on to Utah. And you see this tremendous work of what does computation enable that wasn't possible before. So it's different than, sure, it's information in the sense of Claude Shannon, but it's beyond that. It's in this deep idea of what's computational and how the computational can help us to see other things in different ways. But another thing to think about, we often think of innovation and these kind of things in a very linear way. So if this was true and you were doing incredible things with computer graphics 60 years ago, why did these deep ideas take so long to come into the world and for broader use by more people? And so when we think about innovation, we also have to think about it isn't only the idea or the innovation itself that we need to do, but what are the things we need to do to get the innovations into the world and out of the lab? And so again, around the same time, mid-60s, Marvin Minsky, who was at MIT, who was a computational geometer, same with Seymour Papert, who wasn't at MIT. Seymour he's from South Africa, but he did his first doctorate in South Africa, his second, both in mathematics at Cambridge in the UK. And then Seymour was doing work with Jean Piaget in terms of children's construction of mathematical knowledge. And so Minsky and Papert met each other at a conference where they were both, without not prior knowledge, presenting basically a paper that proved the same kind of thing. And so they hit it off, and Marvin invited Seymour to MIT. And at MIT in the mid-60s was the first time Papert was able to use a computer. And so this resonated because the work with Piaget was really on finding out how much even very young children understand about the world and how they construct this knowledge and how does it get communicated and built. And they look deeply at not just teaching of an existing corpus of mathematics, but really how does a 2-year-old start to build mathematical knowledge? How is this possible? Piaget's idea really was, how does knowledge, as was an epistemological approach, how does knowledge continue and build upon itself generation after generation? As Piaget was a biologist. And so with this, they started to look. And so Papert, on the first day, using a computer, was able to work through a couple of proofs and ideas that he had been stuck on for about a year. And so it was this coming together of various ideas from mathematics, from child development and psychology, and from what you could get from computation that made Papert see that the child's development or any person's development isn't only a function of their brain maturation, but it was deeply a function of the kind of tools and kind of materials that you get your hands on in order to work with. And so the idea of computation as something to make things with, as something to share about, as something to construct knowledge with, as something to dream with and imagine, this was the big idea. So on the left, you see one of the early AI projects was in terms of how can you get a machine to understand stacking blocks? And as humans, we get that. But for the machine, it's like, and so it's like, how could it learn? It's like you build a solid foundation. You put the bigger ones at the bottom. You can't let it go off to the side. And so this was some of the early work in AI that in some ways still eludes us. But both Seymour and Marvin would talk about the times of the 60s. And Seymour would call it heady. It was like, because it was a time of really bold imagination, of trying to do things and trying to make things that were very different. It was connected to the world, but also separate from the world. So it's connected to the world because in the US in the 60s, you have Vietnam War, you have really tremendous military industrial complex growth, you have real issues in civil rights and human rights. But there was the idea that it didn't have to be this way. And so large numbers of people were trying to look at what would make a different world. But in the same way, it led people like Minsky and Papert and McCarthy and others to start to think about, well, what is intelligence? How do we understand human intelligence or intelligence in any being? Such that, and the idea of an artificial intelligence wasn't that, it's like in the way that we see most AI applied today, but it was really as a means to, like, by trying to make it, by trying to build it, by trying to program it, programming gave us the ideas that were not possible to try before. And in these ideas, so there was like, we could understand, not just to make machines do things automatically, but really to better understand human intelligence. And if we think of the growth in this understanding in this time, that the computer has freed in order to give us real tools to imagine about this and construct it, it was this heady idea of starting to better understand human intelligence that guided things, and not getting rich or becoming a billionaire or anything like that. And so even at that point, so this is really early. So it's like before we had, personal computers and any of that, children were programming these little floor turtles. And this is also a tip to cyberneticist Gray Walter from the UK, in that you made these things, but the children programmed it. And so what were the deep ideas there was, in some ways, was understanding the infinitesimal and understanding and develop intuition about what underlies calculus, right? So, but by doing this, by programming the machine to do things, but also then use your body so that we would have the children say, play turtle, pretend you're the turtle, and now tell yourself out loud, how would you make a circle? What kind of things would you do? And so the child will say, I move a little, I turn a little, I move a little, I turn a little, which really is kind of where you see the connection in a deeper part of geometry, which wasn't really accessible, because by the time we have students do calculus, they're at least 15, 16 years old, if not when they do it at university. But we lose, well, why is it important to me? Calculus is what enables us to understand dynamics and change. And it's essential in so many fields. But by the time we teach all the rigmarole of doing it with paper and pencil, we've lost most of the students and really lost the deep idea about why we would care. But also there were the deep ideas about how do you make programs for complex things. That also was a deep idea that also got lost. So here's an innovation that came 60 years ago almost, and yet we still don't see it in practice in schools yet. And so here's something where you'd say, there's no country in the world that likes its educational system. Maybe Singapore or a little bit Finland, but now they're not as happy as they used to be. You see South Korea, Denmark, or around Shanghai. But not really, because even in those places, in Singapore, where they said, we've gotten very good at teaching children to, just analyze, giving them the problem, but we're not good at getting children to innovate and to create. And so the deeper ideas still are kind of lost. The dissatisfaction is global, yet fundamental change or taking use of these innovations that exist or making new innovations that would even go beyond where we are now hasn't really gotten through. And so again, it's not a lack of innovation, but it is a lack of, ability to put it into practice in the world. And so with Papert, we started to describe this as learning, thinking about learning in two different levels. In the one level would be like this, where you see the children on the floor learning about a lot of things, about mathematics, about mathematical ideas, about problem solving, about critical thinking, about computation and programming, but also about themselves. And then also able to see these ideas in the world, or see the ideas in the world and bring them back to how they start to understand it, where the idea of, if you're able to write a program about something to make it happen, you're developing this understanding that's far more deeply connected than if someone just tells you the idea. Same time there, this is when Maturana was at MIT for a little while and produced this tremendous work on what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain. And so it was there, and this is Jerry Letfin, who was co-author in the paper, and it was at his lab that was there. But it's the same time of really, we're trying to understand things that previously were almost impossible to understand. And you start to get this way of doing it. And so Maturana, to his credit, returned to Chile because of the importance to him of doing work in Chile, not just he who was like, one of the best people at MIT, could have stayed, could have been famous, could have done so much there, didn't, because of his social commitment. And so it's this part. So MIT gains by having this diversity of thought and diversity of people, because people from all over the world go there to collaborate and to cooperate. And so it's a different sense of thinking of diversity, but an important part, so that MIT gained and the world gained, because in this case, they were making this work public. It wasn't just for private gain. Jerry Levin was a beloved figure at MIT, and you would say, I wanted to have a picture of him that he had these very famous glasses that, he made himself, of course, but that they would flip up. But it wasn't be like flip sunglasses. It was like both were glasses, and he would flip them up and down, and you'd always be walking around campus with a part flipped up. But what was amazing about him, as accomplished as he was that he would walk up to you as a little student or as, a staff member at the university, and he said, well, what are you thinking about these days? I bump into him often going to the subway, and he'd ask, and you go, like, come on, why are you asking me? But this was the spirit, and this is part of the ecosystem where at MIT, everybody was on first name basis. It's Jerry, it's Seymour, it's Marvin, whether they're, and it wasn't like this way of making hierarchy. And it was in this way, it was very meritocratic and very open. So also around this time, this is Bell Labs early, and so it's a lovely book about inventing the future in terms of computers and open operating systems, but in terms of so much. And so you have Bell. I'm going to go through this really quickly. Invention of the transistor, laser, first solar cell. And then, but, fiber optics, oops, actually I have that, the label is a little bit wrong, but it was Charles Cowell, a Chinese American, who was at Stanford that actually did the first fiber optics before the people who were able to use laser and where they had invented it to get there. But it was part of the openness. So I was fortunate to work a couple summers for Bell Labs. And what amazed me, and this isn't that long ago, nothing was password protected. So here you are at Bell Labs, people doing Nobel work, people, they're doing things in terms of telecommunications. But the idea was, as part of the research community, you do not protect anything. All of your research notes, all of your lab findings, all of your data, you didn't even log into your account, but there was no password. And your files were open for everybody to see and to use. Why? Because it isn't just like, oh, this is property. The ideas are for everybody. Ideas are for people to use and borrow and put together. So again, it's thinking of it as an ecosystem where the part about sharing your work was extremely important. And now you see almost the opposite in so many US universities, where it's like people don't want anyone to see their work because they're hoping to get rich off of it. And this hurts the work, and it hurts the research, and it has a strong feeling. So again, thinking about the zeitgeist of the times. So in the 60s, you have the sense of like anything is possible, be able to explore the moon, be able to create these new technologies, be able to apply them, be able to think about how can we make better, vaccines and everything. And so this is there. How do we understand intelligence? But another part of that is that it's open, shareable, and not just as something to get rich, it's something to really improve the world for everybody. And sadly, in a lot of ways, this is getting lost. Same thing. So this is now the early 70s, Xerox PARC, Doug Engelbert. And so much of what we use in computers now came from this lab. So you have Engelbart with the mouse and Ethernet and so many things. Alan Kay there, who with Andres we had wanted to bring to this, but Alan's with some health issues, and so he couldn't really travel. But so all the ideas that wanted bitmap graphics, object-oriented software, and so much, but and Alan and Seymour, all these people were also putting this in the hands of children, knowing that children are going to come up with better ideas to use it with than we would be there. But the idea of personal computing really grew from this lab. And it's Xerox, and so another really good book is called Funneling the Future, because Xerox at their lab invented all this stuff, yet Xerox as a company, if it still exists, I'm not even sure, didn't make use of any of it. And so it went into the Apple computer. There's the famous visits of Jobs and some other things there where they saw the value in the ideas and were able to put it in the hands of people. So again, it's a matter of creating the ecosystem to do these kind of innovations. Bell Labs, early on at the, at MIT, Xerox PARC, had done all these kind of things. They created the space for people to invent. They were very collaborative spaces. People would go deep. They have crazy ideas. You wanted to have crazy people. You wanted to do this. You had Licklider, who was an MIT professor, but was in charge of the, but the DARPA, the Advanced Research Agency for the US government, who would fund these people, not like bankers in the sense that, oh, we're only going to do things that are safe and that we believe and that you can show this. No, fund the people with crazy ideas, where even the failures are interesting. And this put a basis, so now you see it popularized in terms of Silicon Valley and failing, but it's really different. Because the idea was like, you needed the idea and the primacy of the idea. And in the idea, if you're really pushing things forward, it's not going to be exact. It's not going to be right in the first time. And that's okay. So this is another part of the environment. And a lot of this did get into some of the early technology companies of what to do. But I want to make the point is that PARC, Bell Labs, IBM Labs, that did this tremendous work, they don't work in the same way anymore. And you don't see the same type of innovation coming from them because they were working for the idea. And then what did the company say? Why should we invent this stuff that other people are going to use and get rich of? So people learned the wrong thing from the failure at Xerox, the failure to adopt the ideas from Xerox PARC. They learned, well, we're not going to fund this and other people get rich and we go out of business. So it loses. We wouldn't create these environments for people to share ideas and hold them and test them off each other. And you see, here's an idea that starts at Bell Labs and then it's done at Stanford and all of that. And so in the kind of competitive and market nature, we're losing the basis for some of the most important innovations because of this kind of closure and lack of transparency. So I found this photo. This is Silicon Valley around late 60s. And at that time, it was mainly an area of fruit trees. There was Hewlett Packard, there was Fairchild Semiconductor, and there was obviously Stanford University. But the area wasn't that. It still was fruit trees. Now, Silicon Valley, I think if you just take that part of California, it would be like the 6th largest economy in the world. So it changed and grew. But what helped it change and grow in ways other places like Bell Labs was in New Jersey and around New York, MIT, Harvard, there in Boston, and a lot of things developed, but then they died in ways that Silicon Valley didn't. And so what Silicon Valley was able to do was that there was an openness of spirit and collaboration, of support, and a work between, the support for the public. So instead of people saying, why should I pay taxes, that goes for innovation, which is so prevalent or goes to universities or education for everybody, that was so prevalent in the US, is that no, it was an idea of like a mutually beneficent ecosystem across all the different types of institutions that are there. So the population, public education, advanced research, companies, businesses. And so what helped it grow, so it wasn't just, so you had Stanford, but there was like a place called Fry's Electronics, which I'm not sure even still exists. It did a few years ago, but I read something about it. But Fry's Electronics was like, man, it was like, an incredible theater, grocery store, whatever, for electronics that you could go and build. And so around the same time, this so-called homebrew computer club grew. And so these were people that were like making their own and doing this stuff. So you had people, not just for their jobs, but out of their passion of like building your own computer, making it and applying it to different things. So the Media Lab, which was founded, 83, 84, but in process for a while, was an experiment in the beginning to transform MIT. And so Jerry Wiesner, who had been the president of MIT for quite a while. He had also been the science advisor to President Kennedy, and also very active in terms of civil rights in the Boston area. as president of MIT, he was frustrated. And this is going back to the early 80s, so probably not many of you were, alive or adults at that time. But hard as it is to think of now, so many wonderful advances in the early 80s were being made in computers. This is when personal computers first started to come to the world. This is as mini computers were able to undo what the mainframes were doing by making possible networking. And it was a decentralized approach to thinking about something that used to be very hierarchical and very top down, like mainframe computing, but then not just in that area. So you had what Wiesner said then was that so many incredible innovations are coming into the world and it's changing our lives as computers are entering into every field. And so the Media Lab was thinking about, and the inventions weren't coming from the existing computer science or electrical engineering departments that were more focused on formal things, faster compilers, proving languages or proving programs. And so, and you wanted the space. So the space had to be interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, where it wasn't just, oh, let's get a sociologist and electrical engineer and this person to talk to each other and they each speak different languages. Everybody there would develop their own kind of interdisciplinarity. And then working with others who also had theirs just grew up. So the lab was built around computers and music, computers and vision, computers and learning, computers and AI, etc. And it was this way that it tried to do. Now, MIT had labs before the Media Lab, but they were focused on a particular problem, and then they would go away once they had done enough work in that problem. And so, but this one was the first that actually had its own degree program. So it wasn't just, a lab to do the work that was brought in people from different disciplines, but then you got a master's or PhD in this. So I have a PhD in media arts and sciences, but nobody knows what that means. And it means something totally different for me than for another colleague who also has the same degree title, but did totally different work. So it changed MIT to bring the different siloed departments together as spaces to do things, but it also changed the graduate program. And this was really the work of Papert, where the idea wasn't that, for a master's, you take, it's a 2-year program, you take 20 classes over the 2 years and you do a thesis. No, classwork was de-emphasized and personalized. Anybody with the work with their advisor could take any class that they wanted. And then, but what you couldn't do was that you then had to, everybody did their own research project, which often wound up in a group or wound up as a theme, or was very personal. And so it changed the academic program, thinking that what you do and what you make was more important than which classes you took. And you only took classes to augment and supplement the kind of projects and thinking and research that you were doing. And so this is the old Media Lab on the right, which is IMP, and this is the new Media Lab on the left, which is Maki. And it was something also that changed MIT, because MIT, even though it should be one of the most beautiful campuses in the world, because it's right across the river from downtown Boston, the river's there, there's a small park along the river, it used to be very ugly. And then there was the idea of like, no, we really need to transform the space inside and out. And so inside the early Media Lab, it was a huge atrium, but the idea was that you wanted people to flow. So it was like early in terms of glass walls. And back then we didn't all have our own computers, there were computer gardens. So all the students would be there through the night working on their projects next to each other, which gave a very fortuitous bounce to collaboration, ideas flowing across departments, ideas coming from here being used over there, because the idea was like open, share your work. I'm showing you the atrium because that was actually, it was a great idea, but then it was one of the problems. So behind the wall actually was a theater space we called the Cube, which was just totally open and nothing, because the idea was that with every artistic experience, it would create its own environment. And so we wanted to create the blank environment that would enable all of that. And so another of the innovations that was important for Wiesner was the importance of arts in everything. And so MIT really didn't think this way in the past. which was like, oh, arts, that's fluff, or design, that's just, making something pretty. No, it was really the importance of arts deep into anything that you do. And so arts and galleries and performance space were always a part of it. Now, part of the problem was that you would have your lab space or your office in some place of this, part of some behind that. And so you wouldn't flow through the whole space. You would kind of either take the elevator, go up the stairs and get to your space, and you wouldn't see the ideas that were supposed to be there for you. So the new Media Lab changed that, where the interior of the space was something that kind of forced you to flow and forced ideas to spread and forced you to see things that you might otherwise, just with your focus on your own work, not see. And then the Stata Center, which is Frank Gehry's, so it's a view of all. I love it. Not everybody does. Chomsky's office is I think this one, and he hates it because he says it gives him vertigo because he's looking, glass, floor to ceiling glass, and gives him the willies. But the interior of the space also was so that you would see each other's work. It would be open. And so you get the kind of, again, with the flow of ideas. But what was interesting, I only realized this looking at these pictures, is that it's huge if you look at all of this. But inside, you don't get that sense of hugeness like you do in the new Media Lab building, while still having openness. And so you see these geometries are then creating small working spaces that are still not like designated as this office or this place, but that you go to. And it's interesting how sound flows through that building. Anyway, so a quote that I like, again, for us thinking about innovation is that not just, oh, what's the problem? But it's like, well, why not? Why couldn't we go in the way that we want? And this takes the spirit of a kind of cartoon physics where, Wile E. Coyote can run off the cliff, but he doesn't fall until he realizes he's off the cliff. So if he never looked down, he would never fall. And in some ways, you need this kind of sense of disbelief in order to really innovate. You have to go against the grain. You have to go against. But that's the other part about thinking of ecosystems for innovation that gets lost, which is that how do you get not just to invent it, but how do you get the world to take advantage of it and do new things and use your innovation as part of an ecosystem to help more innovations, but where the values are there and still felt, so that the value of I'm doing this for the benefit of the world in the way that we think of natural ecosystems. So again, to think about, so let's really think, what would be a minimum set of things that you need to be able to develop these innovation cultures? I want to show you quickly, I know I'm running out of time, but from a project that we did 25 years ago in Thailand, where Thailand then had some of the largest economic growth over the previous 15 years, but they knew it was just in things that were exploitive, that, it was like they would have low wage work, low skill, and so they could compete with other countries on labor costs, but that would go away as things went. And so they looked at, and plus having a society that was becoming more and more unequal wasn't palatable to them at that time, because it's like you can't have a peaceful society with so much inequality in it. And so they wanted to say, okay, how do we change our education system such that we can develop new ideas, innovations, new industry, new ways of working that would improve the country. And for them, education in the rural areas, as well as on the periphery of the big cities, was the biggest problem, where education in those locations was bad. So this was our project. It's like, how could you bring in computers as a means to improve education? And at that time, we had connectivity, but it was really bad. And especially in the rural areas, we didn't have it. But in some ways that was better, because as opposed to saying, okay, look at this on YouTube. Oh, okay, here, let me broadcast this lesson, because countries broadcast lessons on television before, and that didn't change anything substantively. And so the idea was like, how do you improve rural education? And so we took ideas that really come from this part of the world, which were foreign there, like ideas from Paulo Freire about make your curriculum the basis of, make your community the basis of curriculum. And so if you talk to families, if you talk to the ministry people, they say, oh, these families don't care about education. You talk to the families in the rural areas, they would say, schools don't give us what we need. And so you have this, vicious circle of, people not liking education, education not changing, not teaching, not developing teachers well, not paying teachers well, not respecting teachers much, and then thinking things are going to change. And so we brought in the computation and made it as the study. And so we worked in quite a number of areas. I'm just going to show one of them. But this was an area where they used to burn the forest, as a means of clearing it. But then that caused greater problems. So that during the monsoon season, it would rain, it would flood, you'd lose all the good topsoil. By the end of the year, you don't have enough moisture in the soil, and you can't grow things, and everything's kind of dying, which also makes it easier for the fire to get out of control. So this became the area of study, is like, from their choice, the health of the forest, and how can they improve life in the community. And so with little sensors, with things, again, all open, low-cost technologies, this became the basis. So you didn't just study math, study chemistry, study this as a means to then later do something. What is the idea? Is no, you learn your math, you learn your biology, you learn your chemistry, you learn your physics, you learn even other things in terms of, the humanities, in terms of community life or economics, through the basis of your projects. And then this is what enabled it to go. So if you want to say, what makes a healthy forest? This is what they had to discover. And it's not like experts could just say it or tell someone, and then that's how you learn it. You learn it through these projects and through doing things. But one thing, so last week in one of the discussion, or one of the panel presentations, someone emphasized, I forget the name, I'm sorry. Someone emphasized the idea of what you learn and how you learn it as being essential. And this is something that we've been emphasizing for decades. But so the what is now all of a sudden, how do you really study this? What's fundamental to understand about mathematics or about physics, such that we can apply it to real important problems? And so we'd say what's problematic in existing educational systems now, and when you think about it out of context, you say, how is this possible? In chemistry, in so much of design and engineering, we don't think about materials in the way that we should. With students, we emphasize efficiency, but efficiency as regards to what? So how do you make something in the cheapest? How do you make something, so that it operates the fastest? But why we're still teaching people in ways that helps us to develop more plastics, or apply plastics in more products, or apply plastics in these things, is mind-boggling. It's almost criminal at this point that this kind of education should be there. Same thing with younger children. What is fundamental for a child to learn now when you have computation? And mathematics is maybe the best example of this. We're not learning rich mathematics, and we're not doing it well. Most people wind up saying, not good at math, don't have a head for math. And it's not the case. Just as like you have a head for Spanish if you're born in Chile, or you have a head for English if you're born in the US, you have a head for mathematics when you're in a place, in a culture that uses mathematics to develop ideas and to think. And this is what's fundamental, not what you have to do with rapid calculation. And so these kids in this rural area, rural school, got this, learned to program, learned the richer mathematics, put it together in an interdisciplinary way where the project was the glue that held the different ideas and different things together, and multiple projects enabled you to do this. So this community totally developed from every family being in debt to being a totally circular economy. So that they were able to, going from burning the forest, having floods, losing topsoil, to maintaining the forest, creating a reservoir, purifying the water so that it's drinkable, generating their energy from the way they've managed the water, growing extra crops, growing things organically. So you went from a place that everybody thought was a disaster to a place that's like now a model community there, but not only there. And so it connected the children, not just using school as a warehouse to put them so the parents can work, but really everywhere. So the children's projects in their learning environments were the projects of the community and work together with it. So what's missing from what and how is also with whom. And you see in the rural areas, they didn't have expertise to help them on their problems. They could find things online, but didn't matter. And so this is something, so Manuel Castells is the first and best work around the rise of the network society and how this was really changing the world, and to be able to look at this. But what Castells, and this is from discussions with him, he would say not possible in rural areas. Why? It wasn't that the creativity wasn't there, because you could point to the examples of, and it's in Chile, it's in Brazil, it's in Thailand, it's everywhere, is that people with fewer resources often are more innovative and creative because they have to be. They repurpose materials, they use this kind of thing. You see these kind of hacks, you know, here in Brazil, they say jeitinho brasileiro as a way of like just hacking your way and finding something that's there. So the talent is there in the society, but wasn't there were the ecosystems to help innovations flow in both directions. And this is what we have now potentially. And so we, in our work with Andres and the idea of Rizoma and all of this, is that there's so much in nature that actually works this way, that you'd say there's real intelligence. So when we talk about intelligence in nature, what we're saying is that somehow it's having intelligent outcomes, but often the nature of the intelligence is really different from how we think about human intelligence. Where in human intelligence, we often think of my mind, this person's mind, this one is intelligent, right? And as opposed, but in nature, you see it, when nature acts in a way that we call intelligent, it's because it works for the whole. It isn't you say, man, that's a smart tree. So this is an example of slime molds and their ability to navigate mazes. But slime molds, like a lot of fungus and things like this, it's not the sense of, oh, here's the central processing unit. No, it's distributed through it, and we have trouble understanding it, even though it exists and we can recognize the intelligence. We have trouble understanding because the model of intelligence isn't so individual and competitive. It's much more cooperative for the good of all, for the common good, collective intelligence. You see it in, so mycelium networks are just a fascinating thing of like, where you see trees connected to other trees, trees able to warn trees about things. And they're connected through the mycelium that connect the roots. And you see the mycelium and the fungus does things to benefit the whole, but the fungus benefits too. And so it's in thinking about this. Now you could, if I showed you that picture, you could say, oh, this is like, it's from fMRI and it's managing human brain, because our brain is an ecosystem. Our brain is this huge network of doing things, and that really does learn. So as opposed to thinking about learning as just receiving information, it's in this way of like, how do we think about that and how do we better apply it? Octopus also is a wonderful film. My octopus teacher, I'm sure it's there also with a distributed intelligence. These are from our projects in Sao Paulo, where we had kids do the same kind of thing, working with found materials in the public schools, in the periphery of the city, working on projects to improve their community. So whether it's filtering, how do you filter water in a very sensitive ecological zone, like in Natal in the north, or in the Pantanal, the world's largest inland wetlands, about how do you, with energy efficiency, make the rooms comfortable to be in. This one down here is about how do you generate through putting bumps in the street to slow people down. How do you put something in there that actually then generates the power for the street lights? These are all inventions of the kids, 12, 13, 14 years old. They had no experience with computers before, or electronics, or math, or anything like that. This was an intelligent bus. Here's the robot of citizen. And it just goes on and on. This is from either Africa. This is Rwanda on the upper right. This is still, no, that's in Peru. This is in India. But you see, there's no reason that computers need to cost as much as they do. And our work with one laptop per child really was about how do you make powerful, low-cost communicating computers for everybody. And what could change from that? Really as a way to harness what I call the latent learning potential of the world, to make a better distributed intelligence so that everybody is participating. And an example of that would be from the pandemic, where success against the COVID depended upon everybody's understanding, such that then they would get vaccinated, they would do the social distancing. And if we had a vaccine, but people didn't take it, it wouldn't be an effective vaccine. If we had, without people following the rules, we wouldn't be able to control the disease. Even still, even with the understanding, it's hard to control. But it's this learning from nature about building the collective efficacy of everybody that will help us to confront these existential problems that we still have. It's mind-boggling that we have such an active, horrible war going on now. You would think humans would have learned more. The war is causing more hunger through the world. The war is causing more pollution in the world, and we have an existential challenge from the environment, from climate change. As we all know, access to water in Santiago is in peril, but not just Santiago, the whole southwest of the US. India's got temperatures of around 45 degrees. So why aren't we mobilizing for this? And part of the reason the innovations don't spread is that they're not, in a sense, democratized or working for collective efficacy. So we can make technologies, social networks or whatever, that would serve the public good better, but it's up to us to be able to do that. And that's the role of the university. And this is a math class, but it's through dance, programming, and composing music. And I'll just stop there with this challenge. The two sides of innovation and creating ecosystems for them. We know a lot about making innovations, but it's better when it comes from a more diverse and a better spectrum. Silicon Valley is now investing in making things for the benefit of almost nobody. We're just billionaires. And you can't get funding in Silicon Valley unless you think, oh, yeah, here's how we're going to make $1 billion. Not because it's a great idea, not because it's for the public good. And so the ecosystem is out of whack. The ecosystem that helps us to innovate in creating these environments where each person can be innovative, but then these innovations can spread. This is what we really have to work on, because the problems that we face as humanity are huge. And we can't ignore who can make the next innovation. It doesn't obviously have to come from London or anywhere else. It's going to be better when everybody's able to do these things and get them into the world. So that's our challenge, is to improve our educational systems, improve our ecosystems for innovation, improve our laboratory spaces, and work on the things that are important for the world, because we face immense challenges. So thank you for your time. I'm sorry if I spoke too long.
Muchas gracias por tu exposición, David. Bueno, reitero quienes aún no tienen su equipo de transmisión simultánea, porque vamos a dar inicio a la conversación con la invitada, a la decana de la Facultad de Educación de la Universidad de Paula, Louzano, quien dará inicio a esta conversación con David Cavallo vía streaming. Paula, no sé si gustas tomar asiento.
No, porque acá me perfecto. Gracias, Maricia. Muchas gracias, Andrés, por la invitación. Saludo a las autoridades, a los académicos, a los estudiantes y en especial al profesor David. Oi, David, eu sou brasileira. Imagino que em português você fala um pouco, né? Bueno, pero voy a hablar en español, que estoy acá en Chile. David, muchas gracias por la inspiradora charla y conversación que abriste acá con ese grupo. Como decana de la facultad y como parte de la comunidad académica de la Universidad de Portales, me quedé pensando cuando hablaste de cuál es el minimum set, ¿no? ¿Cuáles son los elementos mínimos que tenemos que tener si queremos desarrollar un ecosistema similar al que hablaste y que nos mostraste, el MIT, Xerox o estos países que han desarrollado estas experiencias innovadoras? Bueno, el primero tiene que ver con el espacio. No cabe duda, bueno, estamos acá en la Facultad de Arquitectura, no tengo ninguna duda que ustedes tienen súper claro que el espacio es clave para generar y crear la innovación, ¿no? Yo creo que tener eso claro es muy importante porque estamos a puertas de una planificación estratégica, de iniciar la implementación de una planificación estratégica que sí quiere fomentar la innovación y la interdisciplinariedad. Me llamó mucho la atención que el Building 20 no fue intencional. O sea, estaba ya en un edificio que porque no era intencional no tenía las paredes que en general solemos hacer para separar los edificios y eso generó colaboración y multidisciplinaridad. Eso me pareció muy interesante. Lo otro es la importancia de pensar la conexión de la innovación con el mundo, ¿no? Con el mundo fuera de la universidad, que creo que también es clave y pensando en el sentido que tiene una universidad, en especial en un país tan desigual como Chile. Lo otro es poder entregar las herramientas para construir el conocimiento y no entregar el conocimiento, que es lo que suelen hacer los cursos más tradicionales. No, un espacio o un modelo que entregue las herramientas para la construcción del conocimiento. Cambiar el currículum a la par de eso. Y cuando das el ejemplo del Media Lab, ¿no? Y de que hay un degree que está asociado a ser parte del laboratorio, eso muestra el valor que tiene de hecho esa experiencia innovadora. Y no es como algo que yo agrego, ¿no?, a mi certificación tradicional, sino es la innovación o la interdisciplinaridad, es mi certificación. Yo creo que eso también nos trae una interesante idea sobre para dónde tenemos que ir. Bueno, la idea de la colaboración, la idea de share ideas, ¿no?, de compartir ideas, y que es tan difícil en la universidad como describiste. Y creo que por último, y ahí voy a hacer una pregunta de $1 million question to you. Por último, la idea de propósito, ¿no?, que dijiste al final que algo que se ha venido desapareciendo del mundo de la innovación y diste el ejemplo de Silicon Valley. Y que como universidad, y como esta universidad lo tiene demasiado fuerte, el tema de la justicia social, el tema del enfrentamiento de la desigualdad y de la diversificación de las élites, como dice siempre nuestro rector. Entonces, mi pregunta hacia ti, David, es: ¿cómo la Universidad de Portales, no sé cuánto la conoces, yo sé que vas a venir acá a conocer, pero no sé si ya tuviste la oportunidad, pero te voy a contar algunas cosas y quisiera saber cómo ves, cómo tu experiencia y todo ese conocimiento internacional con respecto a la innovación en distintos contextos nos puede ayudar. Mira, la Universidad de Portales, el lado bueno, voy a empezar por el lado bueno, es muy diversa. O sea, nosotros estamos en el centro de la ciudad, es inner city, pensando en lo que podemos aportar al entorno, ¿no?, y al que el entorno nos puede inspirar. Es muy diversa, yo creo que hay mucha disposición, o por lo menos alguna, soy brasileña, soy siempre optimista, alguna disposición a la innovación, y creo que ese seminario es un ejemplo, Factoría es otro ejemplo, algunas innovaciones que sí existen son ejemplos, y el plan estratégico que acaba de empezar, ¿no? Que estamos poniendo en marcha, también tiene la innovación y la interdisciplinaridad en su centro. O sea, hay una voluntad política, institucional de hacer el cambio. Sin embargo, yo creo que todavía somos muy separados disciplinarmente. Para que tengan una idea, yo nunca había venido a esa facultad. Yo soy la decana de Educación hace 5 años. No sé si habla mal de mí o de la universidad, de su modelo educativo. Both, maybe. Pero es un hecho. Yo creo que hemos conversado algunos académicos, algunos decanos, sabemos que eso es así. La universidad tiene esa tendencia de hacer esa separación. Lo otro es que tenemos generaciones muy distintas. Los profesores pertenecen a una generación y los estudiantes a otra generación, ¿no? Entonces, la manera como piensan y cómo actúan la nueva generación, los Zoomers, la Z, es muy distinta. O sea, yo creo que está mucho más cercana al modelo que usted nos mostró, pero también eso no quiere decir que nuestros académicos no tengan esa claridad y etcétera. Yo creo que otra cosa positiva, y que quiero terminar con eso y pedir tu consejo acá a nuestro grupo, es que creo que tenemos una de las fortalezas de esta universidad, la vinculación con el medio, que tiene mucho sentido con todo el tema del purpose y de la innovación para el cambio, la innovación para aportar a la sociedad, ¿no? Y en especial, bueno, yo soy de la Educación, así que tengo que hablar un poquito también de nosotros, en especial con colegios públicos, ¿no? Tanto del entorno de la universidad como de toda la región metropolitana y colegios vulnerables. Así que creo, mira, escuchándote, viendo todos los proyectos, veo mucha sinergia entre lo que se puede hacer acá y lo que se debería hacer, pero quisiera tu consejo, how do we go from here? Gracias.
Muito obrigado, é grande prazer para conhecê-lo. Okay, yeah, it's excellent, and I love hearing you, and especially with the concrete focus. And I think it's like we make the best gains when we have this kind of concrete focus in terms of what can we actually do, but that's based in the kind of deeper ideas or bigger aspirations for how we would like to see change. You know, thinking, I meant to mention this, but it's not that when the Media Lab was created, that the rest of the university said, oh, fantastic, we're going to do things differently. Quite the opposite. And it carried on for decades, especially as the Media Lab got more famous and got more funding. It was tough. But like what you were saying with the students, all of our students at that age, sometimes the world just changes anyway. And we kind of want to pretend, oh no, it's not different. But yeah, change is this good change, real change, for good or bad, is disruptive. And you know, there is going to be resistance. And it's not like you can't do it until everybody agrees. But if you do it and nobody agrees, then it won't go anywhere anyway. So in every case, so for whichever university or department in a university, it's going to be unique, and it's going to be based on the people there and what they hope and what they want to do. And the change won't just be linear. You know, it's going to, or monotonic, like it won't only increase or decrease, it's bumpy. And you have to accept that and accept that spirit. And it's kind of like, we don't have, nature is telling us we don't have the control that we thought we did, right? We think, oh, well, we'll pump all this carbon in the atmosphere. Oh, we'll just make a machine to take the carbon out. No, it doesn't work that way. We still pump too much in. or create too much plastic or do too many things and still have problems of inequality or hunger and all of that. So we need to create these spaces that will innovate, but that won't, solve everything immediately or in one shot. Then you say, okay, good or bad. When MIT first, I have a loud dog. When MIT first, had wireless throughout the whole campus, it opened up to the faculty to make suggestions about what kind of things should we do differently. So with a colleague from the mechanical engineering department, we proposed, lecture lab is an outmoded format. Because at MIT, so many of the courses were like, you have your professor twice a week for an hour and a half each time for a lecture, and then you go to the lab to do your exercises. And we said, with everything being digitized and everything, with physical materials with computation in them, we can change it. And so our proposal was, let's redo the introduction to mechanical engineering based upon your professor has the most knowledge and most experience, and bring the materials there and do the lab things, because we used to have labs because they were expensive or dangerous. So they were in a different place. But that doesn't have to be anymore when you have things digitized and you have connectivity. So we said, let's just change it. And you do this work with your professor and then expand it otherwise. Well, that proposal was turned down. Why? The older professors told us, it was good enough for you, it's good enough for them. And so there was resistance to change because it would be work to do it right. And so too often we get like what we saw with pandemic schooling. We didn't make the best use of the technology. The technology wasn't fairly distributed in the first place. You didn't have enough people with devices and connectivity or enough for a family with multiple children. And we used it and it wasn't so good. It's not the fault of the technology or the potential of the technology. It was a fault in how we thought to use it, which would require change. One last thing. So going back to the Thailand project, we hired a number of graduates from their IT programs at a Thai university to work with us in the rural areas. And what we were surprised about was that at the beginning, these teenagers, young adults were making these incredible projects to use computers, even though they weren't familiar, to improve agriculture, to create new business, to do all these kind of things. And they were able to program and debug the programs far better than the students that had degrees, certificates in information technology. Because why? They weren't doing things as students. They weren't making programs. They weren't making systems. And then they were afraid, because in school we became afraid to show, I can't show what I don't know. As opposed to like, all right, I got to do it. And yeah, it won't be right at first, but I'll get there. And that spirit. And so it was this way of needing to change the university so that we didn't just talk about things, but we built the capacity to do things and built the spirit that is like, we'll find a way. This kind of growth mindset, we call it now, and resilience, but also this kind of hacking in a positive sense spirit that, yeah, we'll work this out.
Gracias, David. No sé si alguien quiere hacer una pregunta, ¿cómo quieren proceder?
Si alguien quiere hacer una pregunta.
¿Alguien quisiera hacer una pregunta al profesor David? Bueno, vamos a seguir la conversación en el segundo panel también, de todas maneras. Así que.
David, bueno, muchísimas gracias también por tu charla y por estar acá con nosotros el día de hoy. Aprovecho a hacerte una consulta antes que nos vayamos al descanso. ¿Cómo crees tú que de alguna manera los indicadores, los KPI, patentamiento, etcétera, que de alguna manera se basan como en la protección intelectual de lo que se está haciendo, atentan en contra de estos modelos que promueven un ecosistema más abierto de interrelación, donde la cooperación y de alguna manera la libertad de acceso a la información son claves? Ya que en el contexto actual que tenemos nosotros, en el contexto universitario, esos números o esos indicadores son claros. Me gustaría saber cuál es tu reflexión con respecto a eso.
It's complex, and it's not actually my area of expertise. You know, deep in our culture, from the Media Lab or the AI Lab in particular at MIT, the idea of free software came from there, not as a rebellion against price or rebellion against an economic model, but as a rebellion against proprietary knowledge that would be for the good of all. And, you know, so examples would be like with Ebola disease, that the articles published were out of the reach of the researchers and doctors in Africa to do it. So it doesn't make sense. And you look with the vaccine for COVID, it was an international cooperation. There were ways of openness that let various places do things, but still you have parts of the world that are under-vaccinated. So in just so many ways, the system is broken. And so you would see that, you know, you want, so the idea in principle of a patent to, you know, protect so that you get rewarded because of some innovation that you did, in principle is important because you want, you know, there has to be a way to fund this research, you know, to do things, particularly for the public good. On the other hand, when it becomes the protection or you patent things, and software patents are don't make any sense to me, you know, that so because it so restricts and it says, well, if you do this, you have to send money there. It doesn't make sense. So we need really a really different system for funding of research, for funding of work, so that researchers can feel free to actually go and not necessarily be the first one to succeed, or not necessarily be the one that's going to get all the benefits. So it's working as of now to promote inequality, to promote ignorance, and to stop collaborative and open work. On the other hand, we need these other sources such that, well, you can do this research and you can try to do these things and you can advance knowledge, not just because, oh, I'll become a billionaire or, you know, but no, this is an important idea. Even if we have no idea, so many of the ideas were like, you only realized as the world changed how important that idea was, even though, you know, it's from, you know, so many, like the sketchpad of Southern, you know, it's 60 years old, you know, so you don't necessarily know until computers get stronger, or we have more of them, or you have this networking, what's there. So it's a system in dire need of fixing. And like any big complex system, it's going to be emergent as it goes. And it's going to take a variety of things. But we all need to start to contribute to this because, you know, it's really just a broken system where you can't do enough research, or the research is only funded for particular things, or you do the research and then you just lose, and it's equally distributed, the punishment, but not the reward. So it's in dire need of fixing, but the only way to fix it is to keep inventing new things and put pressure on the reasons why they needed to be invented.
Muchas gracias, David, por tu respuesta. Bueno, los dejamos invitados ahora a un pequeño coffee break y después de eso volveremos con la mesa de conversación. David, te dejamos invitado también para la mesa de conversación que va a ser en unos minutos. Muchas gracias.